Lycanthropy, the werewolf. One of the most iconic monsters in media is the werewolf. Maybe ever? It has become shorthand for the inner beast within us all, a transformation that defies human nature, claws and fur, rampaging across the foggy moors or gothic cathedrals, the countryside of England, the suburbs of New York City. Our collective subconscious and imaginations are captured by these beasts. Yet the modern werewolf is actually fairly recent. Most werewolf lore we hold as the core tenets of the mythology are not traced back to some 18th century text or the werewolf trials in Europe or even folklore and mythology from centuries prior, but rather 1941. Universal Pictures' The Wolfman. That's right, modern werewolves were invented within the last century. Silver is a weakness, the full moon, the transformation. All of it was based on the codified version of the werewolf presented in this film. And while it lifted up a lot of elements from mythology previously, The Wolfman is the first piece of media that brought it all together.
Werewolf? What's that?
Well, that's a human being who at certain times of the year changes into a wolf.
You mean runs around on all fours and bites and snaps and bays at the moon?
The modern werewolf can best be summed up with a little poem said in the film. Even a man who is pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
I love the company of wolves.
There is not a great work of classical literature associated with the werewolf. There's no werewolf Dracula. There's no werewolf Frankenstein. There's no werewolf Jekyll and Hyde. There's no Invisible Man. Just modern culture. In fact, there's not even a piece of modern literature like Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire that we can associate with the werewolf. The best werewolf stories are recent, but why is it that we haven't had that revolutionary high-end narrative that reinvents the werewolf? What is the perfect werewolf story? What do werewolves mean to people? If someone were to try to create a modern literature masterpiece involving the werewolf, what iconography, what ideas would they need to consider before crafting this tale? At the end of this video, we're going to come up with some loose associated ideas for a writer to take into consideration before telling their own werewolf story. Because, quite frankly, this is all a subtle attempt to get more werewolf books made, or more werewolf films made, or more werewolf comics made, because I love werewolves so freaking much. I'm sure the word werewolf will sound ridiculous on my tongue by the end of this, but what are you going to do? But werewolves mean a lot to different people. That's why I asked for some help on this one.
Hi, my name's Lizzy. You'll find me on social media as Lizzy Lemon Drop, or The Final Whore on TikTok, because I got harassed off of my first account on TikTok. Yeah. I have a bachelor's and a master's in film studies. I'm a part-time teaching assistant for film studies. My area of expertise is mostly on American horror films. I wrote my thesis on Wes Craven's directorial style and consistent theming in his writing. So that's my thing I'm good at talking about. Horror movies, and especially American horror films.
Hi, I'm Madeline May. I am a YouTube video essayist, musician, etc., etc. I do a lot of things, but I guess currently video essays and music are my big things right now. Yes.
Sounds about right. While the werewolf is iconic, werewolf media is more a niche subgenre of horror. I first discovered the werewolf by watching the Universal monster films, The Wolfman, Werewolf of London. These were my first werewolf stories, so I kind of assumed everyone saw those as the default. Well, as my interviews confirmed, not so much.
I believe the first werewolf thing I ever saw was American Werewolf in London. My dad showed that to me at way too young of an age, which was his which was his style at the time, was to show me movies I was not ready for.
Did you hear that?
But I remember not really understanding too much about what was going on because, again, I was very young, but being very mesmerized by the transformation sequence that happens in the movie, which now I know is considered like one of the most famous werewolf transformations of all time.
question for you. What was the first werewolf story, first werewolf film, first werewolf whatever that you first remember seeing? Like your earliest werewolf-related memory?
Scooby-Doo.
Yes, I love it.
It's Scooby-Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf.
One where Shaggy gets picked at random by the Council of Monsters because they need a werewolf for their NASCAR race. And in this particular movie, for some reason, Shaggy is a professional race car driver. And so they pick Shaggy at random and they force him to become a werewolf so he can compete in the race car competition.
It's like being held at gunpoint to play Mario Kart.
It is. So that is definitely my like earliest, most concrete memory of like something with a werewolf.
So we had different backgrounds here into the werewolf myth, but in theory, there's some commonalities between all these werewolf stories. So what is the actual source of the werewolf legend? The first werewolves can be traced back to mythology. There are numerous stories of people who transform into animals. King Lycan of Arcadia, the source for the term lycanthropy, is regarded as one of the first werewolves in recorded folklore. Again, I emphasize recorded because it's possible these myths could have been previously stated through oral tradition. King Lycan slew his son and offered him as dinner to the god Zeus. Now, this wasn't a human sacrifice, by the way. Lycan just wanted to test Zeus's knowledge. If Zeus was omnipotent, clearly he recognized the taste of human flesh, right? This infuriated Zeus, either because this felt like a breach of hospitality, tricking the guest into eating something he didn't want to eat, or because Lycan was trying to test Zeus's knowledge and authority as a god. Either way, Zeus restored Lycan's son to life and turned Lycan into a wolf as punishment. While the modern werewolf is entwined with vampires today, thanks to movies like Underworld or Van Helsing, in medieval Europe, the werewolf was more associated with witchcraft. Much like the famous witch trials, werewolf trials were held throughout Europe, especially in Switzerland, Germany, and France. These trials continued until the 18th century in some parts of Europe. Of particular note is the story of Peter Stump, who confessed under enhanced interrogation to being a werewolf who devoured his neighbors. Modern historians don't really take Stump's confession seriously, in part because werewolves don't exist, but also because he confessed only after some very enhanced interrogation. Stump claimed, however, that he was given a magical belt by the devil, which allowed him to transform and devour women and children. Also, accounts of Stump's confession were spread throughout Europe by second-hand sources, by pamphlets. So it's possible Stump didn't even say what we believe he said. Isn't history fun? But regardless, the story captured the imagination of Europe. But anyway, it wasn't until the Penny Dreadfuls that the idea of the werewolf as this romantic, gothic monster originated from. Much like how the works of Varney the Vampire or The Vampire helped set the stage for later, greater works of gothic vampire fiction, like Carmilla and Dracula, to rehabilitate the vampire into a gothic icon. But before 1941's The Wolfman, there were many elements of the myth that circulated. The vulnerability of silver, for example, was hinted at in various myths, where townsfolk would melt their silver into bullets or into knives. But it wasn't clear if the townsfolk just didn't have bullets on hand and were just desperate to melt whatever they could into a weapon, or if silver was actually something the werewolf was allergic to. And in fact, the nature of the transformation was also unclear. Was it deliberate? Was it you turned into a monster once? Did you become a wolf or some wolf-like monster? There were many contradictory narratives floating around. And it's clear that even Universal didn't have the codified werewolf in hand when they started working on it. The original drafts for The Wolfman were heavily inspired by Native American folklore. Even their first attempt, Werewolf in London, the werewolf functioned more like a Jekyll and Hyde character than the modern werewolf, and in fact looks more like Jekyll and Hyde. You've seen Werewolf in London, right? The original? Not American Werewolf in London, but like... Because Werewolf in London is such an odd outlier in the werewolf story, because it basically plays the werewolf as like almost like a Jekyll Hyde kind of thing. Like, the werewolf
Well, and
gets shot, and he has a whole monologue as he's lying on the ground, explaining his motivations and how he got to this point. I'm like, this is, like, really unusual for werewolf stuff at the time, I'd say.
Well, and there's I can't remember what it's called now, so I'm so upset. There's a sequel to Werewolf in London.
Oh, She-Wolf of London, I think it means?
She-Wolf of London.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, She-Wolf of London. And that one's super interesting on that front too, because that one plays it a lot more like is she crazy? We spend a lot of time in that movie not being sure if the werewolf is even real. That's just another, like, yeah, they play it up as this, like, Jekyll and Hyde. You lose complete control of yourself, which you see that a lot in werewolf media to this day.
But in 1941's Wolfman, they got it right. The Wolfman centers on Lawrence Talbot, a descendant of aristocracy who has returned to his ancestral home after living in America. He courts a young woman and, on a date to a local fair, is bitten by a werewolf. From there, Larry transforms into a bipedal monster every night, hunting a victim designated by the mark of the pentagram in their palm.
It shows the wolf and the pentagram, the sign of the werewolf.
Werewolf? What's that?
Talbot is in many ways the archetypical tragic werewolf. Previously, werewolves were seen as evil fiends, deliberately choosing to become monsters to defy God's design for humanity. But Larry is cursed to be a bloodthirsty monster, seeking to stop his inner darkness through any means necessary. In this sense, it's kind of similar to the possession storylines we see today, only rather than exorcism being the way to purge a person of the demons, the only way is more permanent. When they wrote The Wolfman, 1941-42, with Lon Chaney Jr., the writing was written from the person who wrote the script he had just escaped the Weimar Republic. You know, he just escaped the rise of the Nazis. And I think it's very telling that the werewolf sees a sign of their next victim, which happens to be a star. I mean, it's a pentagram, yes, but in the hand of their next victim. I feel like that's telling, given, you know, the Jewish writer leaving Germany. I feel like those components make sense together.
Something that I think goes hand in hand with a lot of werewolf media, and there's there's layering reasons for this, and it's not always great. You know, there's a lot of problematic facets to this fact too. But something that goes hand in hand so often with werewolf media and stories are romanis.
You've been a long while coming.
I'm not buying anything.
And I am not selling anything. I expected you sooner.
Is the Romani fortune teller that knows that something is going to happen. They warn you. And again, this is not always great, right? The Romani people are not always, like, being well depicted in these associations. And, you know, it also comes a lot from the fact that werewolves is inherently, like, Eastern European concept, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, I think that has something to do with that it's born of that too, is that the same way that Jewish people could recognize the anti-Semitism, the Romani people know when we're also victims of this same thing, and it can also, like, be know what will harbinge in this sort of danger, right? And so you see these things layer together.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting too how in both the first two Wolfman movies, The Wolfman and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, the one Romani fortune teller, she tells Lawrence Talbot, you know, listen, you're a werewolf. This is what's going to happen to you. You're going to hurt the people you love. And, like, all the things that go wrong are because people ignore everything that she says. Like, she's right about everything from start to finish in both films. And she knows everything and is the smartest person in the room at any given moment. But because of who she is, they just discredit her. And you see people, you know, when her son, who's her son Bella, played by Bela Lugosi, very apt casting there. When he dies, you know, beginning of the movie, he's killed by, and of course he's like a on all fours werewolf in that one. He's not like the bipedal we see with Lon Chaney. He's just a wolf on all fours. But when he's killed, all the Romani people start celebrating. They throw a big party, and there's this great scene where she's in, like, the crypt. And there's the priest who's, like, just flabbergasted that they're celebrating this person's death. Like, they're happy about it. Like, and she kind of says, you know, you have your traditions. You keep your traditions. Let us keep ours. And the priest just refuses to accept this, but he just kind of gives up at a certain point. And, like, you never see him again. But, like, she's proven to be right throughout the whole movie after that point.
She's right the whole time.
Bela became a wolf, and you killed him.
You're insane.
And that is a running thing too. Is one of the things that white people are always doing wrong in horror movies is not listening to the Romani woman that tells you this is a bad idea.
Every time.
Don't do that.
Go now, and heaven help you.
Would love to hear a Romani person's perspective on like depictions there.
Yes, and so because like I said, is while I find this interesting, and I agree with you, a lot of the time the depiction would favors the perspective of the Romani characters, is also very stereotypical. It's very much from a non-Romani perspective. They're always using the slur.
Yeah. It's
So
almost fetishistic, almost
yeah.
you'd say, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't tell you anything tonight. Come back tomorrow.
And even when you had the Hays Code going on, like you couldn't show that many graphic things, you still had this man who would, he would just lament that he had caused all this harm. Like he saw himself as a harbinger of pain. And I think lesser films, even movies with better werewolf effects, they don't always contend with that. Even American Werewolf in London, which I think is a great werewolf film, like he has the memory of all the people that he's killed. And you have the one friend who is killed at the beginning of the movie, and each time he shows up, he's slightly more decayed.
More and more
until he's like a skeleton in like the porn theater. It's so great.
It's such a great concept. It's really good.
Like it's like the previous deaths are weighing on you that much.
Has it occurred to you that it might be unsettling to see you rise from the grave to visit me?
Sorry to be upsetting you, David.
But also like really cements the idea that this is like the consequence of like the uncontrolled werewolf.
That's what makes it such a tragedy. Is that, like I think we were saying, is American Werewolf in London really, really leans into like how tragic it is.
Oh, deeply.
Awful and disturbing it is. And like, so like I was saying, is like I think that's the thing you should, most of the best werewolf movies really need to hold. Is this sense of loss of control over your body and your being.
And what I find so interesting about that movie is you get this sense of the werewolf without really seeing the werewolf all that much. You basically only see the werewolf at the very end. The transformation is what everyone remembers, but you barely see that creature until like the last 5 minutes of the movie. And even then it's like you mostly see its head moving around. I guess they spend a lot of money on the effects for the transformation, but and it's effective, it's disturbing, it's tragic, but what that accomplishes, it always cements you on the human story of it. You really cements you in the human tragedy of the incidents and all that, which I think is so effective.
Well, and they really bring you in. My favorite scene in that movie is when he goes to the phone booth and he calls his little sister.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. That's heartbreaking.
It's so very good. It really, really just like crashes this character back down to like, this is a whole person and he has a whole life. And he has a family, and he loves them, and he's never going to see them again.
Most modern werewolf stories follow this, from Curse the Werewolf to An American Werewolf in London. The monster is an uncontrollable other that overtakes an innocent person's body and drives them to hurt others, often those the person in life loves. While the curse is supernatural, there is no greater entity like a god or devil controlling it. Zeus isn't punishing someone, nor is the devil blessing someone with a demonic boon. It's a curse from some nebulous source passed through the teeth, almost like rabies.
Werewolves kind of started out as kind of like this parable of like the animality of humans. This idea that there's this like wild, uncontrollable part of us that's just like waiting to be let out. And I think that's kind of where I imagine the myth of werewolves started. There's this idea that a person can just like lose their mind, can just lose all sanity, lose every part of them and become like this wild beast. I mean, I'm not a cryptozoologist or anything like that. I don't know if that's where it comes from or not.
Some storytellers see the werewolf as a means to discuss mankind's untamable nature, and while most modern werewolves are tragic, some, like the fiends in the Howling, embrace that animalistic nature. They're in command of their lycanthropic selves.
Becoming a werewolf was like the worst thing you could be. But to me, I really felt the opposite of that. I thought being a werewolf was the coolest thing ever. And I really liked the aspect of it that you can't control it. That it was a change that you had no control over, and you have, like, everything just kind of goes away and you become a completely different person. And I think that was because I wanted that as a kid. I wanted to just, like, completely just lose every inhibition, every part of me that I just wanted to all go away and become a completely new, different person that had no memories or thoughts of a past life. It was that wildness of it, I think, that really appealed to me growing up, because to me, the curse of not knowing or becoming so different wasn't horrible to me. That was exactly what I wanted at the time.
Others, however, like the werewolves in Underworld or Twilight, are a pack that looks out for their own. They are in command of their transformations, but they're not evil. They're just there. They're just separate. They're the other. But they're not malignant necessarily. They just exist. They take care of their own.
Jacob could become a werewolf whenever he wanted, and he was like still like, you know, he was still himself as a werewolf. He maybe got like angry and stuff like that and had like, I don't know, dog-like qualities to him. But the thing is, like, if you become a wolf, you're still kind of yourself, which to me kind of defeats the purpose of the werewolf. To me, the most interesting part of the werewolf is that you do lose yourself.
Other times, the werewolf is an allegory for personal transformation, such as puberty. And other times, the werewolf represents the ultimate outsider and can thus be identifiable to anyone who does not fit the mainstream mold.
But don't you know you should never leave the path?
I've only just got onto the path. I was perfectly safe before.
It is good to just kind of like let yourself be this thing that you fear, because maybe it's not like that bad. Maybe it's not like this mysterious evil stranger or whatever it is. Maybe it's like good that you are allowing yourself to be every aspect of who you are, even the stuff that's scary or that's not acceptable or that you don't like, or could even be like dangerous. Like sometimes, you know, I know in therapy they say things like it's okay to be angry and scared and vicious and all these things. Like it's okay to have those emotions. If anything, being a werewolf is just a way to deal with it. I mean, sure, you're killing people, which you could learn to get better about that.
Yeah.
I guess unless they're the bad guys, just usually just some weirdo in these movies. That when the werewolves are good guys, very rarely the villain is usually just a creep anyway.
It's either a creep or another werewolf usually, or
another werewolf.
Dracula. Or Dracula,
or Dracula, as in the documentary Van Helsing.
Indeed, actually, it's funny. There's actually a bunch of Dracula films where he's beaten by a werewolf. Like, if you go to analyze,
that's interesting because everybody always says the vampire would win.
The original Universal cycle, right, with Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman.
Yes.
The last appearance of these monsters is in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is a comedy, of course. But he's decided to start hunting other monsters, and like the end of the movie, he kills Dracula.
I think that's a big part of it. You know, werewolves are sometimes they're thought of as like the opposite of vampires, but I think that this is a big thing that werewolves and vampires have in common, is the different types of predatory nature of sexuality and the way we understand our sexuality exteriorly and interiorly.
Vampires, they were kind of made to be very overtly sensual creatures. Like people want to be with vampires. And I think some filmmakers figured initially that werewolves would be the opposite, something that's like animalistic, the internal sexual demons externalized, and that no one would want to the werewolf. Regardless, very few stories lift from the folklore I mentioned prior to the Wolfman, other than, most notably, Angela Carter and her works, which were later adapted into the masterful Gothic classic, The Company of Wolves.
The Company of Wolves, where fairy tales end and nightmares begin.
So Angela Carter's, a lot more of her writing happened in the 70s. A lot of the things that's vital about Angela Carter's writing and a lot of her fairy tale rewrites is that she was an active sexual liberationist, which put her at odds with a lot of the other most vocal second wave feminist scholars at the time. She was a very stalwart in the promotion of women's engagement with sex and sadomasochism.
Granny says wolves might not always be what they seem.
How can a wolf be worse than it already is?
The innately sadomasochistic nature of sex and sexual development. So a lot of her stories really lean into that from the perspective of young girls and the attraction to sex and the attraction that comes in that sort of sadomasochistic nature in which women both have to and somewhat want to deal with when it comes to dealing with sex and sexual desire under a patriarchy. At the end, Rosalind decides to become a wolf. She both has this erotic fixation and draw to the wolf exteriorly through attraction, through desire, through a sort of masochistic enjoyment of the dynamic, but also through a sadistic enjoyment of the dynamic. She also embraces she is a wolf too.
Obviously, the grandmother tells those little stories throughout the whole movie. That first one especially, she marries this man. The man goes off on a hunt. He goes buy cigarettes one night and never comes back. And then she ends up marrying another guy.
Back with milk.
Yeah, he comes back with milk. And he marries another person who makes her miserable. But then he comes back, and it's so strange because even though he has this transformation, even though he has this reaction to her marrying another man, it's that moment at the end when the new husband slaps her.
She had this moment of tenderness for the monster.
He looks just the same as the day I married him.
None of the grandmother's stories ever really give her a sense of peace with the world. It always makes her more aware of how dangerous the world is. And just, I guess the moral of the grandmother stories is to accept it and try to fit into that society, whereas the werewolf breaks away from that normalcy, I think, in a way that's really interesting. And I think that break from normalcy is a theme in one of my favorite werewolf movies, The Howling, where the werewolves entirely exist as their own commune. And the struggle is this doctor comes into the werewolves and he's like, no, we have to fit into society. We have to progress with the times. And the conclusion the werewolves come to eventually is fuck society. Let's just do our own thing.
If you keep your inner beast tame, nothing bad will ever happen, and everything will be good, and we can all keep going to church and marrying off our children at 14, and there'll be no problems, and everything will be normal.
Like the good old days, the way that the founding fathers intended, without new werewolves. Aside from European folklore, many werewolves have been tied into native folklore, often in a way that resorts to fetishistic tropes, such as the noble savage. Tribes are often fetishized by non-indigenous writers to make werewolves feel closer to nature. A lot of this can be traced back to Whitley Strieber's 1978 novel, Wolfen, and the film based on it, of the same name. Most notably, the role-playing game Werewolf the Apocalypse relies heavily on these tropes as well. That's not to say that it's a bad thing to have werewolves draw from native folklore. You can have a werewolf that lifts from totemic iconography. Just please be mindful of how you're writing it, and if possible, hire a native sensitivity reader, just so you can avoid the pitfalls that many unintentionally fall into. If you don't, you may spread harmful rhetoric and ideas that can spread negative or even harmful beliefs about native people. You may not, but you really want to take that chance. I wouldn't personally. But what of the other traits? Are werewolves bipedal, or did they run on all fours? Are they more man or more beast?
My favorite model of a werewolf is definitely the Wolfman, as opposed to literally turning into like a giant wolf. The Wolfman tends to be my favorite and my image, in part because that's what the reluctant werewolf looked like.
Hang on, gang! We're gonna plow right straight through this stuff!
Shaggy really had an impact on you growing up.
Sure, yeah.
I'm hit or miss on the bipedal werewolf. Like, to me, it's really gotta look like a wolf. Like, it could be a monster wolf, but it's gotta be, like, as classic as the Lon Chaney Jr. Wolfman is. It just looks like a very hairy guy with some big teeth. It doesn't really look like a wolf. It's just kind of like a scary dude. I like it when it is a wolf, but it's gotta be, like, a big wolf. It's gotta be, like, this is not a wolf. This is, like, a scary monster wolf. Like, you know, even, like the Twilight one, I don't think is that bad. Like, Jacob turns into a fucking giant wolf. Like, that's the kind of thing. It's got to look like more. You can't just be like, oh, here's two wolves. This is the one. Like, oh, you can't tell which one's the wolf, which one's the werewolf. To me, that's not as interesting.
Is the werewolf transformation cyclical or is it permanent?
I always get some of these werewolf movies mixed up in my head. The one with Jack Nicholson?
Oh, that's Wolf.
It's one of those movies where at the end of the movie, the main characters just, like, become wolves and stay wolves at the end and do this wolf, like, love affair or whatever it is. I think that's Wolf, right?
That's
Has
Wolf,
that ending?
Yeah. That's how
that
Wolf
is
ends.
Wolf.
Yeah.
That it's how Wolf ends. And to me, again, like, that is the perfect ending to me. It's like you just remain kind of this thing that you've always kind of kept in. Like, you just let it happen. And I think there is some untapped potential in this idea of, like, maybe it's good to, like, let the werewolf out. Like, maybe there is something good about, like, needing to express yourself.
What are your opinion? Have you seen the movie with Jack Nicholson, Wolf?
Yes, it was so long ago though.
Yeah, that's a one that's a bit controversial because that kind of breaks a lot of the rules. Like, it does the whole thing that Ginger Snaps does, where, like, you transform and then that's it. That's just you now.
You're just stuck like this.
You're just stuck like that. You do the one transformation and that's it. You can't go back. But it also does, like, a very slow werewolf transformation where it's like almost kind of you're kind of going the whole time like, wait, that's it? Like, they just give Jack Nicholson a little bit of makeup and he's like looks basically like Jack Nicholson, just a little fuzzier.
It was frightening.
Oh yeah.
Fair enough. Jack Nicholson is frightening.
Oh, he's terrifying. He might be scarier without the makeup than with the makeup, honestly.
But yeah, I think that can take the wind out of the sails too.
Mm-hmm.
When you have those partial, like, Ginger Snaps really nailed it because Ginger Snaps was thematically leaning into so many other elements that kept it interesting in other ways. But I also agree a lot of the time this concept of, well, then you're stuck like this after it happens once. And it's like, well, that's also, like, kind of, that takes away some of the tension.
Yeah.
Because one of the other horrors of, like, okay, if you just turn into a monster and you're a monster forever, well, then that's that. But one of the horrors of being the werewolf is when you have to wake up the next morning and, as a human, contend with what you've done.
Beyond the material, what do these werewolf transformations mean, both in context of the story and to the readers and viewers interpreting said material?
I love werewolves. They're my favorite horror movie monster. Of, like, all the classic ones, I would say werewolves are my favorite. And I would even have dreams about, like, wanting to be a werewolf as a kid and thinking that would be, like, really cool.
You see, now they call that being a furry, but...
They did. No, I kind of make this joke, because I talk a little bit about it on my channel, that I was a furry before I was trans. And I just didn't realize that was the terminology for it. Because I remember, like, being, like, 5 or 6 and, like, wanting to be, like, an animal of some kind, or just something different from me. So, like, I was obsessed with movies and media where somebody would, like, become something else. And usually in media that happened to be animals and stuff. So werewolves really fit directly into that because it was somebody turning into something else. And I think as a young in the closet trans kid that wasn't happy with her body, stuff like that really appealed to me, which is why I still love werewolves and stuff like that to this day.
We need to bring up my other favorite werewolf movie, which is of course Ginger Snaps.
Yes. I was waiting for you to bring that one up because I knew you were going to bring it up. I was going to bring up, the Howling. Oh, that's good too. Like, no, let's get to Ginger. Let's just jump right into Ginger Snaps.
Let's get to the real shit. The good.
And in that you see the werewolf as an allegory again, like for sexuality. In this case, burgeoning sexuality.
Hey, take it easy. Who's the guy?
For burgeoning sexuality, for puberty, and of course for drawing the best and most obvious conclusion that somehow was lost on so very many filmmakers before, which was, there's like a 50% of the human race that does literally have a body cycle that moves like the moon.
Can't imagine what that is.
God, what if we made this like a metaphor for that?
This is a very confusing time for your sister. Boys, her body, trying to fit in.
Yeah, because puberty is already such a terrifying concept. Your own body's turning against you. Why not make that monstrous as well? Like turn him into a giant wolf creature at the full moon. Well,
it's got one of my absolute favorite scenes in Ginger Snaps is the bit where they're in the guidance counselor's office and they're like, and lots of blood and hair in weird places, and she's just like, yep, that's very normal.
I think she's gone.
That film was hitting notes that you wouldn't see until Jennifer's Body years later, and even then you don't see that as much anymore. Like and it's funny too, if you really look at it. Aside from She-Wolf of London, which you mentioned before, there's very few, and A Company of Wolves, there's very few werewolf films that center on women. Yeah, there's very few. Like,
yes,
that's just one of the
something.
Yeah,
there's something that people seem to take about werewolves as being inherently masculine that I disagree with. It's one of the reasons why I love Ginger Snaps. One of the things I love so much about The Company of Wolves.
Though I should say right now, I find it very funny how Teen Wolf from the 80s, that one, handles male puberty with the werewolf narrative by having a guy get all hairy and be good at sports and needing to learn the value of friendship and balancing all of his life issues. While Ginger Snaps also uses werewolves as a metaphor for puberty, and it's just so much blood, and your body is transforming in ways that is grotesque and horrifying. Two very different stories using the same monster as an allegory for the same life transition, but one's from a male perspective, one's from a female perspective.
I'm gonna be quoting a little bit from a ContraPoints video I saw recently that I think sums this up very well, where she talks about in a recent video how a lot of stuff like Twilight and this kind of this kind of sexual fantasy of the of like being controlled or being like taken like forcibly against your will, which some people have seen as problematic in the past. I think for a lot of women, like, we're not supposed to want or like these things, so we want that excuse to be able to do it. So I think for me, it's like I knew that it was like bad to have the wants and desires that I had, which I didn't realize at the time were that I wanted to be a woman. But I feel like with a werewolf, like, well, it's not my fault. I can't. I'm a totally different person. I've just become. I have no control over this. Oh well, it's not me. It's something else, which I think allowed me to kind of exist in that space where I could just be a werewolf and just be this wolf monster, just do these things and not have to worry about like consequences or maybe even mainly like what other people would say. Like, I can literally just let myself go and have no memories of anything being contrary. Like, I even remember like when I was first thinking about wanting to be a woman years before I came out, you know, there was a part of me that wanted that like fantasy that some trans people have of like, what if I was just born a cis woman? I had no memories of any of this. Would that be good? And there was a part of me that said, yeah, I wish I just had a completely different life. And more importantly, I wish I had a completely different life and could not remember any of this other stuff because the trauma and pain was so great. I just didn't want to have it anymore. I just wanted to be a woman without being any the wiser. And thankfully I'm in a much healthier place now with all of this, and I don't regret anything. I don't wish that I was cis. I'm very proud and happy to be a trans woman. But I think that is still something that appeals to me, this idea of like kind of becoming something else against your will. I guess maybe that's a fetish now. I didn't even think about that. I guess I've got kinks now that I gotta work on.
Now, while werewolves are a trademark of horror, you also see them very often in fantasy as well. An example that comes to mind is the video game Skyrim, where the companions, this warriors guild, are secretly a bunch of werewolves.
I'm gonna bring up something really out of left field on this front real quick, actually.
Go for it.
In Disney's Once Upon a Time, when they did Little Red Riding Hood, the twist with Little Red Riding Hood is that Red was a werewolf.
Oh, so they pull a trick or treat, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Is that Red is the big bad wolf, and it was really good actually because it was from the seasons of Once Upon a Time where the writing was really was good and clever.
So before Elsa, pre-Elsa, Once Upon a Time.
Yeah. Something that I thought they did, and it was surprisingly like horrifying and gross for a TV show that was really targeting like 13-year-olds and was like on this primetime network at 7:00 in the evening, was that like Red as the wolf was eating people. They had this bit where Red where she woke up and she had to like truly contend with like her love. So she ate the love of her life. She ate her true love. And she had to contend with that like his flesh being in her body. Like the show really made that, like they made a point of that being something that was disturbing and horrifying to her, is that she could feel his flesh in her stomach, right? And so like I said, it was surprisingly horrifying and like graphic for like the show that otherwise doesn't deal with it so directly. But that's what I'm getting at, is that like part of what makes the werewolf interesting as a character is that they don't just become a monster and then do monstrous things. They have to go back to being themselves, and that's what's torturous about it. Is as in your human mind, you have to know that you live with that, you did that.
That's a disturbing visual too. I'm not gonna lie. That the thought of that is like, because even like movies that like you would call like adult films with like lots of mature, disturbing stuff, even they don't go into like the idea of like how. Okay, aside from Ginger Snaps, I would probably say
Ginger Snap, where she talks about how she had a hunger for the flesh in her.
It's like, okay, that's a little different. Ginger Snaps goes that far, but
goes that far. That's why it's good.
That's why it's up there. It's one of the best. Harry Potter also famously uses werewolves, but I think the problem with them is that Rowling didn't fully think through the implications of her werewolves, resulting in several problematic elements. And I think it's also telling, too, that with Harry Potter, they make the werewolf into an allegory. Because how they, and this is kind of going into that topic. I feel like we have to bring it up given like the general discussion of werewolves, but like they make it into an AIDS metaphor, which is so troubling for so many reasons.
It's bad. That's the thing, is it's not like that's new either, particularly, right? Is that having the vampire, the werewolf, the monster, having the monster be a metaphor for like queerness. Which, I'm sorry, if you're making a mainstream, if you're doing an allegory for AIDS, you're doing an allegory for homophobia.
Yeah, and the fear.
You just are. You simply are.
Yeah, the gay plague that they were afraid. You know what they call it, the Walking Dead. They called them at one point, the people who were infected with AIDS walking throughout the city. It's like, and all of the fear was just, oh well, at least I'm not that person. You know, which is so. Given the other things that Harry Potter does that are very reminiscent of like. Thatcherism and all that, it's hard not to draw that connection.
But it's not like there's something inherently wrong with conceptually of making like your monster a metaphor for these things. It's that J.K. Rowling, like, she didn't put a lot of thought into it, and so she didn't do a very good job of it. And so it just kind of comes away with these troubling implications, because I know what she did is she had, and this is actually, like, I think one of the chronic issues with the world building in Harry Potter. There's a lot of things I will defend about Harry Potter's writing and its world building from an objective standpoint, independent of J.K. Rowling. But one of the issues I think she ran into a lot as a writer is that she would have one idea for something and she'd like it, and because it's vibes, and then she'd have a different separate idea for a connected or related thing that she also liked but was different vibes, and then she'd just put them together and it wouldn't work. Like, she didn't think through a lot of the implications. So, like, on the one hand, Remus is this tragedy because he was forcibly turned into a werewolf by this adult predator as a child, and so what that becomes a metaphor for, like, the sexual abuse of children, and the way that can, like, isolate you from your peers and make you different and make it difficult, and, like, okay, that's interesting. But then on the other hand, she wanted to make being a werewolf a metaphor for having AIDS, which creates this horrible fucking implication for the other metaphor you're working with here. And she did not stop. I believe J.K. Rowling has been, like, horribly radicalized in the last, like, 10 years. I don't think she was always this terrible. And so my thought is, I feel that in, like, 2003 when she was writing this, she wasn't thinking.
Yeah, that's only...
She didn't think about it. She didn't sit down and, like, truly consider what the fuck she just wrote.
Yeah, especially...
I think she's stupid more than she's
Yeah, well, I mean, she didn't realize the Death Eaters were an allegory for the Nazis either until, like, which was
the costume designers for the movie came up and put them in the Klan hoods.
Yeah, she definitely was thinking of that. But, like, it's funny too. Like, you have Fenrir Greyback, the main bad werewolf in Harry Potter, and the whole thing with him is that he said that he lurks outside of, like, the homes of newborn babies to infect them as werewolves to get them while they're young. And, like, given the allegory, that's so screwed up.
So because no one's doing that, Joanne.
Yeah, like I mean,
that is the thing. That's an SVU plot. Like, no one, like this is not happening. There's no evil AIDS spreader intentionally infecting the children.
Yeah, and it's like, it's only makes sense if you... that's something that could be interesting if you completely divorced it from the AIDS allegory. If you made it into, like, some sort of, like, maybe indoctrination into an ideology, or how people can sometimes get people stuck in, like, certain... almost like a cult. Like, people are born into cult-like beliefs, or... You could do something like that. I think the werewolf works best when you fully think out the metaphor, because if you don't, you get that. So I think we've ironed out a few ideas for a prospective writer interested in crafting a werewolf story of their own. Now, for all of the writers or creatives out there, if you're going to write a werewolf story or even a werewolf comic, what do you need to do? The first trick is to understand what your werewolf means. What themes do they represent? Is the werewolf meant to be an allegory for humanity's collective animalistic nature, a puberty metaphor, or just a cool monster you can riddle with bullets and they keep on charging ahead, with claws and fangs unfurled? Knowing what your werewolf is and what the werewolf's function in the story should be will allow you to craft a narrative around them. Second, figure out what your werewolf needs to be. Is it a bipedal monster, an actual wolf? The form your werewolf takes is often a reflection of the deeper messaging of your story. If your story is emphasizing this horrific monster, then yeah, go all out with the monstrous imagery. But if the wolf is more an allegory, or your story is more psychological, then perhaps opt for just turning the man into a wolf. But I mean, all of us preferred monstrous wolves personally, so I mean, yeah, your mileage will vary on this one. All my interviewers and I, we like our monstrous wolves. I'm just saying. But third, is your transformation a curse or a feature? Is being a werewolf a burden? Are there communities centered around lycanthropy? Is it more a communal home for outsiders or a subculture with a hierarchy? Determining the nature of your werewolf society will impact all facets of your wolves. If you start by answering these 3 questions, you'll be able to build werewolf mythology out from there, and thus establish the rules around your characters. And if you need further recommendations, here are a few werewolf titles that you can keep in mind when drafting your story.
Oh my goodness, the original Wolfman.
Definitely American Werewolf in London. That's one of my favorite movies of all time. The transformation sequence is pretty incredible.
Ginger Snaps.
I'm a big fan of like the Castlevania video games, and I find they always depict werewolves and wolf-like monsters very well in those games. Like they're always like these enemies that you fight, but I've always thought they looked very cool. And a lot of those games are influenced by classic horror, Universal Monster kind of stuff.
Probably Frankenstein meets the Wolfman.
Van Helsing is hilarious. I think definitely check that one out. I do like that the transformation is like the wolf is like kind of like crawling out of the person's body, which I think is an interesting take on a werewolf transformation, and kind of goes back to what I was saying, like this wolf was kind of with you all along. Not technically a werewolf movie, but in the vampire movie Fright Night, which is also one of my favorite movies of all time, there is a pretty cool wolf sequence and wolf de-transformation towards the end of it. Not to spoil anything for that movie, but it goes hard.
Company of Wolves is #1. That's the problem. So I'm trying to American Werewolf in London. I gotta say.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Not bad.
Basic, my basic bitch ass list, but
that's fair. It's probably the basic list of everyone else too.
The Dog Soldiers, the one with
Dog
Soldiers. Yeah. Now, I'll recommend that one, Dog Soldiers.
Oh, Dog Soldiers is great. I love Dog Soldiers. It's one of my favorites, actually.
Very cool. Very cool.
There you go. Also, it needs to be said, we need more werebears. I love werebears. Most were creatures from like they're outside of the werewolf dichotomy. I mean, even Werewolf in London implies that werebears, were-tigers, were-bobcats exist, and we just need more of that. I'm just saying. I really thank you for making it to the end of the video. I want to thank all my patrons and YouTube members for helping support me on this endeavor. If this video inspired you to make a werewolf story or start a werewolf project, please let me know. I'd love to see how my content is helping inspire you to make something fantastic. And if you've learned about a werewolf story from this video, then please watch it tonight or play Werewolf the Apocalypse. It's a lot of fun. We need more games where you can just play as a werewolf aside from Skyrim. I'm just saying. Also, bring back Darkstalkers. Like please bring back Darkstalkers. If this gets anything, annoy Capcom to bring Darkstalkers back.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf bane rules and the autumn moon is bright.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf